My name is Kjaer, and I am the CEO and one of 3 co-founders of SWOOP Analytics. And we are a global software company that focuses on collaboration analytics. And I'm going to give you a quick introduction to who SWOOP is, in case you have never heard about us before. But really, the star of the show is the gentleman on the screen here to my left, which is Gleb Tsipursky. We've actually, I bumped into Gleb online reading one of his Forbes articles, and I reached out to him for a deeper conversation. And I was so fascinated by what he had to say that I thought I'd try to bring him in front of all of you guys here today. Because this whole world we're living in with remote and hybrid work, I don't think it's going to go away. And we here at SWOOP Analytics, we started as a fully virtual company, and have been that since we started back in 2014. So we are passionate proponents of remote and hybrid work, and I think it's been wonderful to. I think you really enjoy what Dr. Gleb Tsipursky has to talk about today. But just a very quick introduction to SWOOP. We like to say that we empower employees and leaders to be successful in the digital workplace, which is, of course, is particularly relevant in this whole world of hybrid and remote work, because digital collaboration and interaction is so important. And Gleb will talk about that during his presentation here today. We analyze conversations in Yammer, Workplace. We look at content in SharePoint. So those of you that are interested in SharePoint, intranet stuff, conversations, Yammer, now rebranded Viva Engage, as some of you might know, Workplace. We analyze that, and generally we look at behaviors, collaboration habits that people have across the M365, so the Microsoft Productivity Suite, and of course, in particular, in Teams. So that is basically sort of like a super fast introduction to why we exist in the world. I know that many of you who joined today are customers of ours, and I'd like to say you a special warm welcome and thank you for choosing to work with us. Really appreciate it. And we also bringing this session together today is what we call a SWOOP Expert Talk. And that's actually a part of our newly launched SWOOP Academy, where we bring together for not just for our customers, but everyone who's interested in collaboration. We bring together a range of different things, basically just to help us all become better at collaborating and communicating online. So that consists of SWOOP Masterclasses, and we have one coming up actually just here it's going to be like in 11 days on the 17th of April. And my colleagues, either Gemma or Coco or Pete, who's on the call with us today, will share with you a link in the chat where you can register for that. But check out the SWOOP Academy. I think we're going to put a link to it in the chat as well. There's going to be masterclasses, campfire sessions, expert talks like the one we have today. And of course, if you follow our work, you'll see we publish loads of content on our blog as well. But I think I want to hand over to Gleb to give us a talk about the research that he's following and the work that he's doing around remote and hybrid work. So over to you, Gleb.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Kai. I really appreciate it. And you do see me clearly and hear me clearly, correct?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, good. All right, everyone. So let's talk about hybrid work, the why and how of doing it successfully. You should all be able to see me. Okay, and if you do have yourself on not mute, please make sure to mute yourself. You can, if you don't see me clearly in the slides that are right by me, just highlight me in your box. You should be able to do that. Just press on full screen so you'll be able to see my slides clearly. All right, everyone. Let's talk about how to do successful hybrid work. The key to working successfully in a remote setting, in a hybrid setting, is to see it not as a loss. And this is something I've seen lots of leaders do. See hybrid work as a loss, as a problem. Go to any headline right now, you'll see leaders talking about needing to go back to the office because you lost the old ways of doing things. You need to collaborate effectively. People aren't productive in hybrid settings. They aren't innovative. Well, that's a really problematic perspective because they're not seeing the reality that hybrid and remote work are a disruption. They're not a loss. And when leaders start to reframe hybrid work and remote work as a disruption, they'll start to think about it as an opportunity. And to think about this as an opportunity as opposed to a loss, as a problem. And so this is the disruption that offers a major opportunity to maximize productivity and engagement. So that's what we want to think about. In order to achieve these goals, you want to help leaders put aside default assumptions, habits, and preferences and focus on business objectives and outcomes, even if it makes them personally uncomfortable. You can kind of understand why they would be personally uncomfortable. They've been successful for 20, 30, 40 years leading in person. They know how to do it. So they really need to empathize with them and understand that people who have been successful doing so need to really put aside their assumptions, habits, and methods of thinking, their existing mindsets to succeed in hybrid work and remote work. And it's not an easy thing to do. So you need to overcome decision-making cognitive biases about the future of work and integrate best practices about doing so. So that's the shape of the discussion we'll have today.
Gleb, we're just going to sort out something because I can't see your screen. And from what I gather, I just asked in the chat, no one else can. So let us just do a, are you sharing? Have you clicked on the share screen?
No, I shouldn't need to. If people can see me, they should be able to see me. I can also do the share screen functionality if that
I
might be
just
easier.
ask people in chat, can you see Gleb? I think people got a no black screen. We can't see me either, just a black screen. So yeah, everyone is saying, okay. No, there. Oh, you just came up there for a moment. There you are.
Okay, should you be able to see me now?
Yes. I'm just gonna ask people and say, yay, so we can see you now.
Okay, good. Weird technical glitch with Zoom. Anyway, I'm sorry, with Microsoft Teams. But anyway, you should be able to see me now. So, as I was sharing, you need to really put aside those assumptions, habits, and preferences and focus on business objectives and outcomes. So this is what this talk will be about. How do you do that? How do you help leaders, help others put aside those default assumptions, habits, and preferences and focus really on those business objectives and outcomes, even though they might be personally uncomfortable with these business objectives and outcomes? Let's talk about what you do. The first thing to think about is data. How do you use data to do so? Well, I really want to rely on external surveys. So I've helped my context of my expertise. I wrote a book called Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams. I have articles published regularly in venues like Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Fortune, places like this. You can Google me and find that out. And I've helped 23 companies by now transition to hybrid work and remote work. And what I find is really convincing for leaders is to look at research surveys. So external surveys that provide actual evidence for what people and how people behave. And so these are surveys done by organizations like the Harvard Business School, like the Society for Human Resource Management, and so on, which don't have any specific stake in the outcome. And what the surveys show is that of all workers, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Western Europe, these are generally similar numbers. They're less applicable to APAC, so India, China, and so on, Japan. But in Australia, English-speaking countries and Western European countries, these are applicable. That 75 to 85% of workers don't want traditional office-centric work. And for example, there was a McKinsey survey, which again doesn't have any stake in the outcome, which showed that when you give remote capable workers the opportunity to do work remotely, 87% of them will want to do a substantial amount of remote work. So only 13% of them want the traditional in-office setting. And 25 to 35% want full-time remote work, including people who would really not want to stay at a place if forced to come in full-time. 40 to 55% would leave their job if forced to come in full-time. And we've been seeing that with the Great Resignation, where companies that are forcing employees to come in full-time or even a lot of the time when the employees don't want to do so, that's a major driver of the Great Resignation. Remember that term. People are still quitting at a higher rate, quite elevated rate, even though the economy is somewhat softening. And over 70% would be less likely to leave if offered substantial remote work. So we see very clear data, very clear evidence of the retention potential and the recruitment potential of flexibility. So substantial remote work, I mean more than half the work week. We know that remote employees, people who are working remotely, are more productive. So when you look at people in the same roles working remotely versus in person, remote employees are clearly more productive. On average, they work over 20 or more hours per month, which is understandable. When you think about the commute, it takes maybe about an hour per day on average. And that's seen as unpaid labor. And people, when you look at surveys, people are willing to devote about 40% of the time they would have spent on the commute to their job. So that's quite a lot of time. That's about 2-ish hours per week. And that's just the time from not commuting. People are also willing to wake up earlier and go and to start their work earlier and stay up later and work later. So working more odd hours, working on weekend, if they can spend more time working from home. And there was a really good randomized control trial on an travel agency called Trip.com, which is a major travel agency, as you can tell from the name. So it assigned about half of its staff to work remotely, part-time, so about half the work week, maybe 2 days a week, something like that. And then it assigned the other half to work full-time in the office. And it found that people who are working remotely were definitely more productive. So remotely some of the time versus none of the time. For example, software programmers who worked remotely at least part of the time wrote 8% more code than in-office ones for the same roles. So that's very, very clear. So that's a very clear and hard objective measure of productivity. And you have for other roles that they found, like HR and marketing and design, they have customer service, they also had higher productivity. But here you have very clear metric of 8%. They also found that they had 35% better retention, which is a huge number. Think about the benefits of getting 35% better retention. You'd be lucky if you have an intervention that causes 5% better retention. But here you have 35% better retention from allowing people to work part of the time at home, and you don't have to pay them anymore. So this is just a kind of a no-brainer that this is a benefit. There was a Stanford University study showing that in May 2020, right after the lockdowns, people who were working remotely were 5% more productive compared to those in the same roles at that time in May 2020. But that productivity improved over time. So people's ability to work remotely and be productive improved over time. By May 2022, people who worked remotely were 9% more productive because we learned how to work better together remotely. We had better tools. We learned how we got better analytics. SWOOP Analytics and other companies provided better analytics of how people worked, and so you can manage that information better and help people perform better. Teams, leaders learned how to manage people better. So there was a lot of benefits that caused people to work remotely more effectively. So 9% more productive by May 2022. Working from home also very clearly improves people's well-being. Mostly or fully remote work would make over 75% happier, again, from these surveys, over 70% feel less stressed, and over 75% better able to manage work-life balance. And I should note that all of this evidence, I see this exactly the same thing when I do internal client surveys. So I just got done with a client survey for a financial management company, which found that, yes, people are more productive working from home. They'd be more likely to stay at the company if they had more flexibility. They're happier, less stressed, have better work-life balance if they can work more time from home. Now, there are challenges. So remote work challenges does cause people to feel overworked and to experience burnout. So more for young adults, over 50% feel overworked, over 55% experience burnout, over 80% want fewer meetings. So those are important issues to address. So the biggest issues, over 60% say they have poor virtual communication skills that they need to improve, and over 55% have technology issues. These are specific tactical things that can be addressed, but they definitely need to be addressed for effective hybrid work, for effective remote work. So that's the data, that's the statistics. We have a lot of research, and I can go into this in the Q&A about the research on hybrid work and remote work. But let's talk about some of the reasons why leaders make mistakes, why they have a problematic approach to hybrid work and remote work pretty often, why there's so many tensions between leaders who want their employees to be in the office most or all the time and employees who want to have much more flexibility. One of the biggest problems is called the status quo bias. This is a cognitive bias. So cognitive bias is a decision-making error that we human beings make because of how our minds are wired. Our minds, it's very important to understand, are really not wired for the modern environment. They're wired for the savanna environment. When we lived in small tribes of 50 people to 150 people, we had to respond to the external environment with a fight or flight reflex. It was more important to flee 100 shadows than to not flee a saber-toothed tiger. You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response. So we have a number of mental errors that cause us to not make the right decisions in the modern world. And the status quo bias is one of the biggest of them. It's a desire to get back to or maintain a status quo, even though the status quo might have changed, even though the broader context might have changed. In the savanna environment, you can see why it would be valuable. It was really dangerous to have changes in the savanna environment. When the situation changed, it was likely to be a bad thing. So it was important for us to be able to go back to whatever the situation was before the change. So to address the change, address the conflict, and to not accept the new status quo, because otherwise we would be
this
unlikely
unique
to survive.
facility.
Okay, somebody unfortunately unmuted themselves, so please watch them. All right, so the desire to downplay the major disruption from the pandemic is a part of the status quo bias that a lot of leaders experience. Remember, I've mentioned that they were successful for 20 years, 30 years before the pandemic, and they want to get back to that successful status quo, to what makes them feel successful. And so you want to really be aware of that as a leader and as someone who supports leaders, who influences them. You want to help them be aware of the status quo bias and that this might be a problem for their decision making around returning to the office and leading hybrid and remote teams, figuring out the future of work. And this is especially important to think about in terms of the AI disruption that's happening increasingly, because the AI disruption with increasing amounts of artificial intelligence, that makes it easier for people to work more in a remote setting, in a hybrid setting, in a remote setting, is because they can get their information easier. The biggest challenge with working in remote settings is how do you get information and share information across the company. With the growth of AI, people are quite a bit more able to share information and get information quickly across the company. You don't need to be in person as much to get information, to connect, to collaborate with each other. But still, leaders don't really think about this nearly enough. Okay, so that's a status quo bias. Another problem is called the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias. If you've heard about any cognitive biases, this is probably the one you've heard about. It's the one where our minds look for information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So if leaders, you might have heard of Elon Musk saying that remote workers are only pretending to work, because that's his observation. He doesn't know better. He hasn't really worked with people who are remote, and he doesn't trust them. So he looks for that information that confirms his beliefs. And so do many, many other leaders when they say, well, remote workers, they're just going to have a job. They're not going to have a career. These leaders just look for information that confirms their beliefs, and they don't look for information that disproves their beliefs. So you want to really address the confirmation bias by looking for information that disproves your beliefs. Try to prove yourself wrong. If you're unable to prove yourself wrong, that's good, then you're more likely to be right. But if you can prove yourself wrong, that's even better, because then you get to have more accurate beliefs and make better decisions. And there's a ton of information showing that remote work is definitely something beneficial for many people. I'm not saying full-time remote work. I'm saying having people work in a hybrid, flexible modality, maybe coming into the office 1 day a week, maybe 2 days a week, depending on what the situation is. And sometimes, depending on the role and their ability, having full-time remote work. that is remote capable. So that's the confirmation bias. Let's talk about another cognitive bias called the empathy gap. The empathy gap. Emotions are the key here. We need to understand that emotions determine our decision making. 90% of our decision making, more than 90%, is determined by how we feel rather than how we think. And you might have already seen that from the status quo bias and the confirmation bias. So the empathy gap has to do with our inability to empathize with people who are not part of our tribe and who have different perspectives. So we underestimate their feelings. When leaders who want to be in the office, when they look around and they see that their employees want to not come to the office, they think from their perspective, well, the mindset is, well, if I was in my employee's shoes, why would I not come to the office? Well, because I'm lazy. And so only lazy people don't come to the office. So they put themselves in the shoes of their employees. They don't realize that their employees often have a different perspective, that their employees are much more capable of working from home than leaders are. And I've seen this so often, where leaders feel themselves to be not as capable of working from home, and so they come into the office more often. In fact, there was a financial institution which I was working with, and it was a mid-sized financial institution, where throughout the pandemic, the boss came in literally every day, drove into office, but he was in the office every day, coming to the office when nobody else was, and he felt that, well, how can you work except from the office? From the office is the place to work. So he underestimated and didn't really understand and realize how other people can work from home. So this is something that for you to understand and empathize with, that other people have different perspectives. Leaders often underestimate the perspectives of their subordinates, but we also underestimate how leaders feel. So we need to be empathetic toward many leaders who feel like, well, you can't build a career when you're working remotely or when you're working in a hybrid modality. The more time you're in the office, the more of a career you can build because you build social bonds with people, you build relationships. And they don't really understand how to build relationships effectively when people are spending time working remotely. So you need to really empathize with them and understand where they're coming from. And the final problem is called functional fixedness, so the final cognitive bias. This is kind of like the hammer-nail syndrome. You've probably heard the phrase that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, when you perceive only one right way to function, you tend to apply that way of functioning to everything else. And so when you learn one way of working, one way of collaborating, one way of leading, you tend to apply that to everything else. And so that applies very much to hybrid work, remote work, and office work. Most of the leaders at least, have learned how to collaborate and how to lead within office-based settings. And thus, they try to apply that method of collaboration, that method of leadership, of communication, like the leadership by walking around, management by walking around, you might have heard of that, to remote settings, when people are working outside the office, whether it's full-time, remote, or hybrid. And that just doesn't work very well. You need to have really different approaches to management, to collaboration, to leadership, to coordination, to communication, when you don't have people working in the office. But leaders tend to not realize that sufficiently. And so they try to shoehorn office culture into hybrid work and remote work. And they fail to adapt strategically to the need to work different in our new reality. And so this is a crucial problem as well that applies to the hybrid work and remote work. Leaders feel frustrated in it and they say, well, I just need to get everyone back to the office, and I'm going to try to get as many people back to the office as possible. And the only reason I might allow hybrid work is because otherwise I'll lose everything. But I really hate hybrid work and I really want to do full-time in office work. Once this economic situation allows me to do so, I'll get everyone back into the office. I've heard those sentiments so often. I speak to 5 to 10 leaders a day, and like I would say 60% of them, 70% of them have that perspective, and it's really something I have to work on disabusing them of and showing them the problematic aspects of their perspective that won't serve them well in the long run. The functional fixedness is a really important part of these conversations. Now, so we've talked about the data, the evidence, the statistics, the surveys. We've talked about the errors that people make. let's talk about some of the best practices for hybrid work and remote work. And the best practice is, for the large majority of companies, is a hybrid first team-led model, where the team leads collaborate with the team members to decide what works best for their team. So you push down decision making as far as possible to the leadership level of rank and file teams, where the team lead, they don't just say to their employees, this is what you'll do because I'm the boss, but they work with their employees and figure out what will work best for their team members. And usually you want the whole team to coordinate around the same perspective, whether they'll work, come to the office 1 day a week, 2 days a week, whether they'll work full-time remotely, to have standardization across the team and to have the team have the same functionality so they can coordinate and collaborate with each other. Sometimes it might work for a team member to work full-time remotely while the rest work in the office, but that's harder and it takes more coordination management. So I find it's best to shift team members into teams that are fully remote if the team member really wants to work fully remotely and they're successful at doing so, and to have the team that most of the teams want to come to the office. That's the majority of the situations. You'll have 60 to 90% of them wanting to come to the office because they want to socialize with their colleagues and they want to coordinate with them, they want to collaborate with them. But you'll have some my employees who are going to be fully remote, and that's going to be a minority, but it will be something like 10 to 40%. It depends on the company. So for example, with my manufacturing company clients, I find it's closer to 10% because, of course, a bunch of people will be working on site in the manufacturing company, and other people will be needed on site occasionally to support them and coordinate with them. Let's say R&D will need to access to physical resources to do some research. And so you'll find that in manufacturing companies, something like maybe 10% of all people will want to and be capable of working fully remotely. Whereas software programmers, it's going to be closer to 40% if it's just a SaaS company, software as a service company. Financial might be somewhere in the middle, like 25, 30%. And you want to have people adopt best practices for hybrid and remote work arrangements, which we'll talk about in a bit. But before teams make a decision, so you want to push down decision making, but first you want to train them. You want to train teams on cognitive biases in the future of work. So we talked about the cognitive biases. We talked about functional fixedness, empathy gap confirmation bias, and status quo bias, to talk about the reversed order in which we discussed them, and best practices for hybrid work and remote work arrangements. And then you want to help them make a good decision. The amount of hybrid work, so hybrid in-office work, should depend based on collaboration. A default of 1 day a week is a great default for most teams to work quite well. And you want to have them collaborate, you want to have them coordinate. This will help team cohesion. And you want to have teams justify any additional days in the office, because there will be a problem where some managers who are more micromanaging at the lower rank and file level will want people in the office more than they really need to be. So you'll want the managers to justify any additional days based on the amount of collaboration teams do. So if you think about why teams need to come in the office, it's really to collaborate. The large majority of the individual work, the large majority of us do our individual work much better at home than we do in the office. So individual work might involve writing computer programs. Individual work might involve writing reports, doing design, graphic design, figuring out marketing collateral, writing copy. So that's kind of individual tasks, focused tasks. Then it would involve asynchronous communication. Asynchronous communication might mean things like writing emails, answering Slack messages, Microsoft Teams messages, anything like that. According to a McKinsey survey, the average worker spends 20 to 30% of their time on asynchronous communication. And of course, it's going to be higher for managers. And then video conference calls. You don't need to be in the office and for video conference calls. It's a bad use of time. And you're going to be, especially since you'll be disrupting other people's, if you have open office arrangements or cubicles, there are relatively few that, even huddle rooms. I'm working with a client right now, and I've just done some focus groups for hybrid work and remote work, and they're complaining that the huddle rooms they have aren't really very well soundproofed. So even if they have a hybrid meeting in there where there's like 3 people in the huddle room and some other people at the other end of the line, they will still be disrupting people outside of the huddle room. And so that's a problem. You need really good soundproof rooms. So having a video conference meeting in the workplace is arguably worse than having it at home, not simply for productivity purposes, for making the commute without any point to doing so, but disrupting other people. The things that you want to do in the office are more intense forms of collaboration, synchronous collaboration, meetings, and so on. You want to have in-depth training, performance conversations, conversations with your manager. Those are the kinds of things you want to do in the office. Mentoring is mostly better done in person. So those are the kinds of things you want to think about doing in person versus remotely. But there are some things that you can do remotely that are going to facilitate effective collaboration. One of these is a technique called virtual co-working. And it replaces that ability to work with each other on the open office or in a cubicle farm where you can easily collaborate with others just by talking about things. So that involves working with team members along a video conference call. Whether it's a Microsoft Teams call or a Zoom call, you sign into a video conference call. For fully virtual teams, it should be every day. Hybrid teams, it should be on non-office days. So if you come into the office 1 day a week, it's going to be on the other 4 days of the week. You sign into a 1-hour video conference call, and you start by sharing the project on which you'll work. Then you turn off your microphone, you leave your speakers on, and your video is going to be optional, whatever you want. So you share what you'll work on and take 30 seconds. This is for a 6 to 8 people team. You share what you'll work on, then you turn off your microphones and so on, and you start working on your individual tasks. Then what you'll see is that maybe 5 minutes and 10 minutes in, somebody has a question, somebody has a problem, somebody has an idea. So they turn on their microphone and share. And then other people can turn on their microphones and respond, solve problems, discuss ideas, maybe do screen sharing. For programmers especially, it's quite helpful to do buddy programming at this stage to solve problems. And then you turn off, and then so you chat for 5 minutes, then you stop. Then maybe in another 10 minutes, there's going to be another question. People talk for a couple of minutes, then stop. And then another 10 minutes, there's going to be another question. So throughout this period of 1 hour, you might have something like 4 to 5 periods of conversation, sometimes 3, sometimes 6, it depends. Then you end by turning on your microphones and sharing what you accomplished. And again, this is working on your individual projects, nothing collaborative. You're not intending to collaborate, but you ask questions. This is incredibly helpful for helping teams bond, especially fully remote teams, but also people who are in hybrid teams on the days that they're not hybrid. It facilitates innovation for having new ideas and good ideas, and it's especially useful for integrating junior team members. So junior team members get a lot of benefits from this modality because they get immediate on-the-job training and they can get their questions answered very quickly. What about innovation? So this is the other form that is difficult for hybrid work and remote work, and why leaders often complain that we need to get our people back into the office. Well, what you can do is have an effective technique that applies to innovation. Traditional brainstorming is something that's useful for innovation, but it's something that's hard to do remotely. So when everyone gets into a room and shoots ideas at each other, it's great for innovation, but it's harder to do on a Microsoft Teams call or in a Zoom call. However, we already know that for a long time, long before the pandemic, that it had a number of serious problems. One is called production blocking. So first is production blocking. That's where you have an idea, but somebody else is talking about a different idea and the conversation gets away from you and you don't want to interrupt. This is especially a problem for people who are introverted or junior status team members. Another is evaluation apprehension. That's where you have an idea, but you're worried about sharing it because it seems too crazy, off the wall, or maybe it implicitly criticizes another team member. This is again a problem for junior status team members and also for people who have a pessimistic bias, who have a pessimistic perspective. And finally, social loafing. That's the tendency where the more people there are in a brainstorming session, the less we feel like working, because it's hard work to come up with ideas. And so we see that the more people that are in the room, the less hard each person works. You get less ideas per person. Virtually synchronous brainstorming is a technique that solves these problems. So it's especially helpful for junior and lower status team members, introverts, and pessimists. Let's go for this technique. What are the steps? So let's talk about the 3 steps. First, all team members generate ideas separately, asynchronously. You sit in your home, you can sit in the office, but separate from each other, and you put them anonymously into something like Microsoft Forms or Google Forms or Mural if you want something visual. So asynchronously, not at the same time, and anonymously. So without knowing who contributed each idea. That asynchronicity is very helpful for introverts because you don't have production blocking. Lower status team members, you're not worried about interrupting higher status team members. Anonymity is very helpful for pessimistic team members and lower status ones where you're not worried about other people judging you negatively. Anonymity is pretty easy to do. So for example, for Microsoft Forms, you can have two areas for input of information. One is for name, another is for idea. And then you have names and ideas in a spreadsheet. Same thing for Google Forms. I often use Google Forms when I facilitate this. Then when the facilitator gets all of the ideas, then they can separately take away the names and the ideas, separate those. So they know who came up with each idea. But let's say that's a 6-people team and you have 10 ideas per person during this period. Next step is you clean them up and you have the ideas, you have 50 ideas remaining because there are merged duplicates. So out of 60 ideas, you have 50 ideas remaining. You know who came up with the ideas, you take away the names and you just give a spreadsheet with 50 ideas to everyone else, to the 6 team members. And so to anonymously comment on and evaluate quantitatively each idea on a scale of 0 to 5 on a variety of categories. For example, you can use how innovative, practical, and exciting each idea is. So now each of these ideas, each of these 50 ideas has a score of 0 to 15 per person. And there are 6 people, so it's 0 to 90 of how innovative, practical, and exciting it is, plus comments from each person. And finally, you have a synchronous meeting to determine how to implement the best ideas. And that synchronous meeting, the facilitator combines the scores, so 0 to 90 for each ideas, and then you have a cutoff, let's say 75, for the ideas that you want to bring into the last meeting. So now you have a meeting to determine the best ideas and how to implement them. And they have been fairly rated. You don't need to worry about being biased because somebody didn't want to criticize somebody else. So you have the best ideas that float up to the top, and you can choose which one of them to implement. And it's great because you can save the ideas for later. You can put them in the idea bank for later. Some of the ideas might be great, exciting, innovative, but not very practical right now because the economic situation is not great. They might be practical in a year or in 6 months. So you have an idea bank for these. And you have a peer-reviewed study showing that this creates more ideas in total and more novel ideas than traditional brainstorming. So very clearly shown that this is an effective technique, more effective than traditional brainstorming. What about integration of junior staff? Well, a hybrid work major challenge is how to integrate junior staff because you make more close-knit connections to one's own team, but you're weakening connections to other teams and to the organizational culture as a whole. So the best solution to this problem is establishing a hybrid mentoring program to address integration of junior staff. You want to have 2 mentors, one senior staff member who's not the supervisor from your own team and one from another part of the organization. That's really valuable. So this mentor from your own team helps the junior employee with on-the-job training and with team bonding. So that's very valuable, of course, for the junior team member. And you want the mentor from the other part of the organization to help the junior team with forming connections across the organization and integrating into the culture of the organization. So remember, a hybrid work challenge is close-knit connections to one's own team, but weakened connections to other teams. This is especially problematic for junior team members who don't really have very close-knit connections to organizational culture as a whole and other teams. So this is the point of having a mentor from another part of the organization. They help the junior team member form those connections and integrate into the culture of the organization. So both mentors should meet with a mentee at least once a month for 20 to 30 minutes, ideally in person, and do a remote or co-working session at least once a week. All right, everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. And this is the why and how of successful hybrid work. I've given you the data, this people make, and I've given you 4 techniques: a hybrid first team-led model, virtual co-working, virtually synchronous brainstorming, and finally, integrating junior team members through that effective mentoring technique, where you have one person from your own team and one person from the external team. I'll be happy to answer any questions right now and discuss with Kai his thoughts on these questions. Look forward to chatting with you.
Hey, Gleb, fantastic. Like everyone, can you use the react button and just give us a thumbs up if you like this, or an applause or whatever, so Gleb can sort of feel the love here in the room. And Gleb, of course, there are loads of questions, right? So I've clicked on the Q&A feature, and because along the way we asked people to ask questions, and I've copied some of them from the chat, some I've put it directly in the Q&A. So I'm just going to take them from the top and we'll see how far we get, right? We have about 15 minutes to go. And for those of you who actually asked the question, if you want to add a little bit more context to the question, just come on off mute and provide that extra context. So I've copied some of them that were asked in chat. I've copied them into Q&A. And I'm asked a bit, I can't actually remember who asked this question, but I'm going with the first one, right? And someone asked, is there a loss of informal learning communication when working virtually? And is this significant? And how do we compensate for that? Now, who asked that question? Are you there with us? And is there more context you want to provide?
Well, I'll answer it while you're providing context. Go ahead.
It was Manuel.
Hi, Manuel.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me share that you definitely have loss of some learning because you don't have quick connection with each other and ability to pass information. In fact, I have an article about this, I believe in Fast Company, about how managers tend to see people who are working remotely as procrastinating more. And when you look at the actual evidence on their procrastination, they're not actually procrastinating. What happens is that the manager can't get hold of them as easily to change tasks that are when their plans change. And so they perceive these workers as being more procrastinating. In reality, the problem is the manager has not set up a coordination system appropriate to hybrid work and remote work, and they're trying to shoehorn the traditional methods of collaboration and coordination, communication into hybrid work and remote work. So that's an example that I've really seen and managers complain about. So yes, you definitely have loss of learning. And what you need to do is to not use the traditional methods of how you learn and communicate and coordinate. You need to set up specific coordination communication mechanisms that are customized to hybrid teams and remote teams. So using things like one tool you can use is, of course, AI. I mentioned that briefly. So there are increasingly companies that are providing AI-informed tools. Another is just documentation, more communication, more coordination. Another tool that I advise my clients to use is to use common hours, like let's say 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. for everyone to be available to answer Microsoft Teams message within 30 minutes to be able to communicate and coordinate effectively. So there are techniques that you can use to address this problem, but you have to deliberately and consciously set up these techniques. Otherwise, you will definitely suffer losses of coordination and communication when you're working remotely.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. And I'm just going to move on to the next one, right? Because I hope we can get through them all. Now, hybrid work, is it 1, 2, 3 days a week? You know, is there? I think the answer is probably no. But is there a sweet spot, Gleb?
Yeah, there is. So when you look at the research on the most amount of time that people spend in the office, you have both research by the Harvard Business School and by Gallup showing that it's closer to 1 day a week, maybe 2 days a week, but you definitely should not be going over 2 days a week. So 1 day a week is probably for most people the best timing, because when you think about the kind of activities that people do remotely that people can best do in their home office versus in the office. The best activities to do in the office are very high impact activities like more intense forms of collaboration, training, performance conversations with your supervisor and so on, socializing. But the amount of time those take on average for an employee is something like 10%. and the large majority of an employee's tasks are going to be their own individual tasks. So like I said, programming, marketing, design, collateral, content writing, asynchronous communication, video conference meetings, that takes up 90% of a typical worker. I mean, I'm giving an average, right? Someone's going to be 95%, someone's going to be 85%. Some people it's going to be less or more. But generally speaking, it varies around this 90% mark, something like that. So 1 day a week is fine for people spending time in the office for the large majority of people. And the reasoning here is that you really want to minimize people's commuting time. Again, that's just empty wasted time. That's over an hour per day for most people that they're going to be commuting. People hate that. The thing that people really despise is coming to the office and doing the same stuff that they would be doing at home. So what I really work with my clients on doing is to helping make sure that you fit the activities that people need to do in the office, which are again better done in the office, into as little time as possible in the office. Usually that works out to 1 day a week. Sometimes it's going to be 2 days a week, but for most people, 1 day a week is going to be fine.
Got it. All right. So closely associated with this is this whole question about culture. Like, can you actually build culture? What the question that specifically is, how do we create culture awareness for newcomers who work 100% remotely? That's something that I'm personally very interested in your view on, because we're fully remote, and I would suggest we do have a culture. Sure. But let me hear from you. How do you build cultural awareness for newcomers?
So what you definitely want to do, you'll want to start with that last technique I talked about, mentoring. And you'll want to have very deliberate mentoring, so that mentoring where you have people who are being mentored by somebody who's from their team, who is not their supervisor, and someone, so you give them the culture of the team, the specific local context within which they're working, the team culture, the team dynamics, personalities, and so on, and just on the job, whatever they actually need to do. Then you also want somebody from outside the team, perhaps from the same business unit, perhaps from a different business unit, giving them some of the context for the organization as a whole and the culture of the organization as a whole that's not their local team culture. And you want them to help that person form connections across the organization, by which I mean giving them introductions to people they need to know across the organization and smoothing those connections. That is the most important way that you build culture across an organization for junior team members who are full-time remote, but also people who are in the hybrid modality. That's also the way that you build culture. That is the most important way for junior team members to build culture. That's one. The second is that virtual co-working. That's less impactful, but that's also quite helpful for people to actually co-work with each other and get quick on-the-job training. So that's another way. And the third way, something I didn't have time to talk about, I talk about it in a 3-hour presentation, is to have social events for remote employees. So things like, let's say, playing video games together online, or doing escape rooms, virtual escape rooms together online. There are a number of other social events that you do together online. You could do something like a coffee drinking event where you send different types of coffee to people and have them sample it and check out what they like, or having lunch where the company pays for their lunch and you all eat lunch together at a certain period of time, once a week or something like that. So there are a number of other events that you can do, but the key is to do some social events with people as well, social events that people like to do. So you want to push down the decision-making on what kind of events they are to that rank and file team level, and have the team decide together, maybe take turns on doing different events on different days. So those are the kinds of things you can do to have the components of culture that have to do with connection. So culture, when you think about culture, it has to do with connection. That is the most important aspect of the culture, really, when you look at the research. Culture meaning connection to your team members, to your supervisor, to the community as a whole. Secondarily, of course, you want people to be onboarded well and to learn the norms, the etiquette, the unwritten rules of the game of the organization as a whole. So that's kind of a secondary, but also important aspect of the culture. What are the values? But I would say the first things I outlined are going to be the most important things, because the way that people connect to the culture is first of all through the people.
Got it. Now, there's a question here, an interesting one from a participant, and I can't recall who it is. I can apologize. I copied it from chat. but it was asked early on in your presentation, and the question was, is there a sex or gender sort of disaggregated data about the evidence you talked about early on about the different preferences of modality of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they definitely are. And we have very clear evidence that women have a stronger preference for working more time remotely than men. For example, there was a conference board survey that looked at men and women wanting to work full-time remotely. Men had something like, in that survey, 39% of them wanted to work full-time remotely. Women wanted 50% of their time to work full-time remotely. And we can clearly see why. Unfortunately, in our societies, women still bear more of the childcare burden, they still bear more of the elder care burden, they still bear more of the house chores burden. So there's a greater desire for flexibility on the part of women than of men. The same applies to other underrepresented groups. So we have very clear evidence that people with disabilities have a much greater desire for working remotely. And it's kind of a duh, right? If you have a mobility challenge and you have difficulty getting to the office, well, you probably don't want to be in the office as much as people who don't have a mobility challenge. And we see that people with mobility challenges especially want to spend more time working remotely. I'm not saying all the time and all of them, but on average, they definitely want to spend more time working remotely. And the impact of long COVID has exacerbated this. So things like fatigue and brain fog are definitely very clear impacts of long COVID. We have, just to give some statistics from the US, we have by Q2 of 2022, there were 1.7 more million people disabled compared to the start of the pandemic, mostly due to fatigue and brain fog symptoms. And people with fatigue and brain fog definitely do better when they can work more of their time remotely. Also, the same applies to Black people. So people who unfortunately, they still have some microaggressions and discrimination that they face when going into the office. So there was a survey by Future Forum among knowledge workers that showed that of all knowledge workers, 21% of white knowledge workers wanted to work in the office full time. Black knowledge workers, only 3%. 3%, that's a sevenfold difference. And that is because, again, Black knowledge workers just still experience microaggressions and discrimination. And so they did not have as much of a desire to work in the office remotely, to work in the office full time, because they can have less discrimination when they work at home.
So part of me is thinking we are sort of fixing the wrong problem here, it shouldn't really be that working remotely is the answer here. It should be, we should be better to be in the office, if you choose to do that. And now there's
sure,
a couple of
other people aren't angels, and
yes,
this is if you're actually want to improve the experience of people who are discriminated against, you probably want to let them have the kind of context and space away from discrimination that they can.
I get it. Now, here on the SWOOP team, something that we pride ourselves in, I guess, is that how much we are collaborating internally across disciplines, and we use different enterprise social platforms. They're different out there. There's a Workplace from Meta. There's a Yammer, now rebranded Viva Engage from Microsoft. And there's a question here from Bobby who is saying, what are some nudges to get knowledge workers to participate more in these social platforms? Because that's another opportunity to create more connectivity and get information sharing happening more freely. Do you have some ideas about how we can sort of incentivize and motivate people, nudge them to do more of that?
Yeah, you want to create rituals that are going to be daily or at least weekly, but ideally daily. So something I do with clients is called a virtual water cooler. So every day, as part of signing into your day and starting up your day, the rank and file teams of 6 to 8 people, or depends, 4 people, 8 people, whatever it is, each of them will share how they're doing right now, how their day has been going so far, what's going on in their personal life to the extent they're comfortable sharing that, and a fact about themselves or the world that other people may not know, and what they plan to focus on at work that day. And then they respond to 3 other people who share the same information. And so what you have, that takes less than 5 minutes. And so what you have is a constant interaction. And throughout the day, you can also chat, and that's going to be on a separate channel. So for example, on the social platform, you can set up a channel for each team for their personal conversations. So that's the way you start each day, with that kind of personal sharing. We call that a daily sharing for the virtual water cooler. And then you have that conversation going throughout the day. Other people respond and they interact throughout the day. And then you restart it the next day. So having that daily ritual, and that's just an example of a tactic. And that's a quite useful tactic. By the way, all of this I describe in my book, Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams. And you'll all, I think the first 50 attendees will get a copy of the book. So you'll have much more detail on all of these techniques in the book. And so what you'll see is that this is a technique, this is a useful tactic, but you can have other tactics, of course. The key is to set up a daily ritual, ideally daily if you have to start it weekly, but a daily ritual which people participate in as part of an expectation, a norm. So you'll need to have the supervisor of the team start it up and do it themselves to prompt everyone else to do it and make sure that they do it throughout the day. And it'll start with, of course, being some effort, because any new habit will take some effort to set up. But eventually, people get into doing it. They'll like doing it, and it's a really connecting activity.
Gleb, thank you so much. We have reached almost the top of the hour, and I'd like to thank you so very, very much for taking time to be with us here today. I'm just going to leave up the screen here, which I can see is a little bit hard to see on this. It comes up with a black background. You're always surprised, aren't you, at live events? Hopefully you can just see there in between the black, the names of my wonderful colleagues who are here today. Thank you so much. If you're interested in more about SWOOP, connect with myself, with Gemma, Coco, or Pete. And otherwise, we really hope to see you at our next SWOOP Expert Talk, and jump onto the SWOOP Academy and check out what we are up to. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gleb. I really, really enjoyed it today. And thanks for joining us all.